Yeah, thanks so much. I think I'll follow up on David's call of this ghastly psychological research that's being done in the world. It's a perfect setup for what this psychologist is about to release on you guys. Now, it's I actually cycled into the college, and somebody stopped me. I think it was a very angry fellow who told me that I'm not allowed to cycle inside the college. So I said, misinformation. And then he looked at me slightly confused. So if you get any complaints about me, I apologize in advance. All right, so I like to start off with a quiz whenever I have a distinguished audience. And just to give you a sense of actually how difficult it is sometimes to think about what's true and what's false. So two of these stories were widely reported. Two of them are fake, so I'm going to ask you which one is true, okay? You actually have to vote and not abstain. Sometimes it's like, really? Okay, so A, Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. Who thinks that's true? Okay, well, it's Putin, right? Who knows? B, baby born in California was named Hard Eyes Emoji. You think that's true? Okay, we see a lot of hands now. Yeah. It's funny, I just came back from California, and I'll tell you a story about how they perceive that headline. Or C, criminal farts so loudly he gives away his hiding place. Okay, there's some good number of hands. So you typically see this sort of split between B and C because people are thinking about plausibility usually. It turns out that C is actually the right answer. So I was thinking that this B works particularly well in the UK because people think, oh, those Californians, that must be true. But it turns out Californians are the same way. So they're like, yeah, that would happen here. So some criminal was hiding in the bushes, and he passed gas so loudly he was running away from the sheriff's department, and he gave away his own hiding spot. And so the Missouri sheriff's department actually tweeted, hashtag when you're having a shit day. And so sometimes the truth is smellier than fiction. Enough with the fart jokes. But you can see how difficult it is to just guess, right? So we actually have a test called the Misinformation Susceptibility Test. It took us a few years to devise this thing, which is a standardized psychometric evaluation trying to grasp people's tendency to either be extremely gullible and just say, I believe everything, versus extremely skeptical and say, I don't really trust anything, as well as your ability to actually discern between those headlines. It was generated using the predecessor of GPT to make sure that people haven't actually seen these headlines before. So if you want to give it a more detailed go, we have that, as well as a very long and technical paper about why you should trust this test, or maybe not. So you can read it and make up your own mind. Of course, I don't have to tell this group about some of the consequences of misinformation in general. I'll get to some academic examples as well. We had 5G. Which I love because it's an example of reinterpreting correlation and causation, right? Why there are more coronavirus deaths where there's more phone towers or 5G mass, right? Or maybe it's some third variable, population density, right? Where there's more people, there's more phone mass. Or the phone mass are the cause of the coronavirus, which is a much more interesting theory. Right? People have actually died in Iran because they ingested toxic products that they read on social media that could cure the virus, of course. Here we have the COVID will change your DNA. What's useful, and maybe for this audience to know, what's interesting to me is that this is actually not a new kind of argument. And so people think, oh, it's a new vaccine, right? And so it's going to change your DNA. That's kind of a new thing. But if you look at some of the historical documents, in the 1800s when Edward Jenner came up with the first modern vaccine, using cowpox against smallpox, you had people who were creating paintings with basically you have a bunch of humans with cows sprouting out of their mouths, sort of suggesting that the cowpox vaccine was going to turn you into a human-cow hybrid. So it's actually the exact same argument, just recycled 200 years later. And so what I'm interested in is these misleading tropes and techniques that are deployed time and again to try to confuse people. This is one of my favorite ones from the UK, the disappearing needle, right? So if you get the vaccine, it actually disappears. I don't know if you know that's true, David, but it's a very compelling video.
Oh my God.
Huge military convoy heading to Ukraine. This is in fact Southern California. This is just a shallow fake that was shared on Facebook that went viral during the conflict. of course, we had Putin sharing lots of his theories, people rioting at the Capitol. It goes on and on, of course, now with Israel and Hamas. Some of the same game footage is being recycled from the Russian-Ukraine conflict, so it's a disaster. But also in academia, uncanny similarity between COVID and HIV. I don't know if you remember this preprint, but this went viral, and people actually interpreted it. So between fast science and fake news, people interpreted uncanny as human engineered, and so this caused lots of controversy because people now thought that it was engineered because of the similarities between HIV, and this was taken down a few weeks after. But there's been so many preprints that people talk about the political nature of preprints. People put them up so they can have their put out a quick argument. Nobody checks the quality of these preprints, and it feeds into news media, right? There was an increasing amount of media that was covering studies, including preprints, but not saying that they're preprints or that they haven't been peer reviewed yet. So this is a huge problem for misinformation as well. I think it's interesting because I try to still avoid preprints, mostly because of what I'm about to tell you. Something called the continued influence of misinformation, but I know some of my students are very keen on them, and I do support it. I mean, I'm not going to tell other people not to do preprints because I do see the advantages, right, of open science, obviously. But I also think there's a danger to preprints in terms of its effect on misinformation. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you too much with definitions. I gave this talk once in a room of philosophers. I did not get past this slide. Oh. I'm not kidding you. Yeah. This is sometimes I give a 60-minute talk. It was just about whether this is a set or a subset and whether there's mutually exclusivity between the two. I mean, misinformation is false. I made it correct. So I didn't have misleading in there initially, and so later when I talked about misleading, I said, "Oh, you're inconsistent because first you say misinformation is false, and now you're talking about misleading." So it's like, okay, let me go back and correct this so that we have it all in the right set. So misinformation is either false or misleading, right? It could be an error. Everyone makes errors, right? If I make an error in this presentation, it's technically misinformation. But I'm much more concerned about the purposeful spread of misinfo, right? Actively trying to harm people with some psychological intention to actually deceive, and when we do that in the service of a political agenda, we call it propaganda. So even the term fake news is used for everything. I'm much more concerned about disinfo. But now let me give you an example of how this is defined in the field when people do research on this, right? So there's basically three ways of doing this. First, you can say, well, what's misinformation is based on what's fact-checked, right? So we can go to Snopes or PolitiFact and see what's true or false, and that's the basis. And lots of studies, their stimuli are solely based on this definition. You can look at the publisher or the source, right? Known producers of fake or unreliable content. So people might say, Sander, can't trust anything he says. So you have lists of NewsGuard, for example, is an organization that rates every major news site in terms of their trustworthiness based on their editorial practices. So there are lists that are circulating with scores of how unreliable something is. And I'll give you a third definition. So I think this is fine for the purposes that it serves, right? The problem with fact-check news is that most news isn't fact-checked, so the stuff that gets selected for fact-checking is very particular. So it tends to be, outright sort of false content. But a lot of content that's not outrightly false but misleading doesn't get caught in fact-checking. When you look at analyses of the media landscape, stuff that's misleading is much bigger than the stuff that's outrightly false. So that's a problem. We all know that sometimes the source heuristic is fine on average, right? But we all know that reliable outlets sometimes can publish misinformation, right? A famous example was the New York Times and the war in Iraq, saying that there were weapons of mass destruction which were never found, and they had to retract that and say, yeah, we published misinformation and we apologize. Of course, good editorial practice is that you recognize mistakes and learn from them and move on. That's the difference with bad outlets. Same with BBC, right? They had the false balance with climate contrarians and scientists for a long time. They always had a contrarian in there, and they stopped doing that a little more than a couple years ago, but it was pretty prevalent. So this is much more problematic for a reason that I'll show you later. That when mainstream sources publish misleading or misinformation, it reaches a huge amount of people, and it's much more persuasive to people. So for that reason, my definition and the sort of research that I do and other people in this area, we focus not on telling people what's true or false, because I think a lot of things aren't so simple as just saying they're true or false, other than, gravity is real and so on. But for the most part, it can be quite nuanced. And we want to help calibrate people's judgments according to the presence or the degree of manipulation in statements, headlines, papers, and so on. So it's about the degree of manipulation. So it's not is this true or false, but can we help people spot manipulation so people can make up their own mind? So let me give you a practical example. This is vitamin C protects against coronavirus. This was fact-checked as false. Health Impact News is also a fake news website. So this stuff's easy, fact-check is false and so on. Now let me give you a different example. The Chicago Tribune published this headline. Healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating. The Chicago Tribune is a respectable outlet. I mean, this is rated as a serious outlet. This headline is technically not false. So a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the vaccine. Right? This was the most shared story on Facebook in the first quarter of 2021. It was highly prevalent among anti-vaccination groups. I just reviewed a study, I guess it's bad practice, but I'll keep it confidential, which did an analysis and actually find that these type of headlines are, and the ones about the blood clots that David was talking about earlier, the sort of kind of true but misleading, are much more damaging to vaccine confidence than the kind of crazy misinformation that people see. And so the technique here is that they're applying causation where there's only correlation, right? By reframing the headline in a deliberate way to get clicks. And so that is misleading. And so even though we can't say that's entirely false, it is misleading because it contains one of these manipulation techniques. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. Okay, now I'm going to shift a little bit. Is anyone here from Madrid? Okay, you go home. No, you can stay. So Madrid is a big city, right? A beautiful city. Love Madrid. 3.5 million people. Here's the flag of Spain. Back to Madrid. Very nice. Most populous city in Europe. So there's a lot of people here in Madrid. There's the airport. Very busy place. Here, curve, growth, lots of people coming to Madrid, right? It's exploding. In fact, it's the most populous city in Europe. It used to be London, but then there was this exit thing, and now it's Madrid. So if I now tell you that actually this was bullshit, Madrid is not the most populous city in Europe, now we're going to have to debunk and fact check, and something really interesting happens in the brain when we have to do that. So as soon as you hear new information, right, you integrate it into your mental model of how something works. So I'm sorry to say to have contributed to this misinformation. So if 2 weeks later you're on $1 million talk show and somebody says what's the most populous city in Europe and you say Madrid, don't blame me. But the idea really is that your human memory is like a network, right? And so it has nodes, kind of like a social network. So nodes are a concept like cities, people, and there's links between the concepts. And the more you repeat misinformation, the stronger those links become. And the more likely people are to continue to retrieve false information. So we know from lots of research that repeating something makes it easier for the brain to process, right? So we're literally faster at processing stuff that's been repeated than non-repeated, whether it's true or false. And that has to do with fluency. So your brain attaches a signal to repeated claims as having, some greater value because you've heard it before and it links to things you know, and so you're faster at processing it. So when you look at meta-analyses, you kind of find that, when you debunk something, people can tag it as false. So now we're going to have to say, wait. So Madrid, not the most populous city in Europe. Negating is already cognitively much more complex, and so now we're going to have to tag that as false. But there might be other links in your memory that now have this connection that we didn't reach. And typically what you see is that debunking can reduce but not fully eliminate misinformation, right? There's a famous legal saying, you can't unring a bell. And it's kind of the same, right? If the jury sort of hears things in the media that weren't supposed to about a defendant, and now the judge says, hey, you have to disregard that. It's very difficult to do. So that's kind of how it works with misinformation. Then the practical problem is that nobody cares about fact checks. Okay, they don't scale. They don't receive the same amount of engagement on social media as misinformation, so that's hugely problematic. A new meta-analysis just came out about the science-relevant corrections, on average, unsuccessful. There was some heterogeneity, but on average, we struggle to tell people that something is false after they've accepted it. So that's why we're trying to focus on the idea of pre-bunking or inoculation. And so let me explain that to you. Hope there's nobody who's vaccine hesitant in the room, but the idea is that it follows the vaccination analogy exactly, but it doesn't require any actual needles. So that's the good part. So you expose people to a weakened dose of misinformation, or the techniques used to produce misinformation, and you refute and deconstruct it in advance so people can build up mental or cognitive antibodies and become more resistant to the full dose of misinformation later on, right? So just as vaccines introduce you to a weakened pathogen to try to trigger the immune system to help confer resistance against future infection, it works the same way, right? Your immune system needs examples of the pathogen in order to mount an effective immune response. And it's the same with the brain. You need lots of examples, microdoses of what deception looks like in order to be able to spot it effectively. So that's what we're trying to do. Psychologically, we kind of need this warning that, that there's manipulation out there because our immune system is sleeping most of the time. Because if we have to critically scrutinize every piece of information, we wouldn't get anything done. So we have to alert people to manipulation. And then comes what we call the pre-bunk or the preemptive refutation. That's sort of how it works. So how do you do this? So we did a lot of lab experiments, and it was interesting. But then we got all these questions about how this actually works in reality. So we thought, okay, how can we take this idea out of the lab and actually help people do this in a real setting? So we took some inspiration from the Harry Potter novels, and I'll show you in a second. So we got these headlines. Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. It's possible to vaccinate Americans specifically, like they need it the most. The disinformation vaccine. So I don't know how happy I was about these headlines. I mean, there is some degree of the psychological vaccine. If you look at our effect sizes, which I'll show you in the interest of transparency, it's not the same as a biological vaccine, right? So instead of 90%, maybe it's 20 or 30 if we're being optimistic. So somebody joked to me and said, well, if you market your vaccine with 30% efficacy, I'm not sure how many people would want to buy it. But there we are with psychological sort of research. One journalist actually called us and asked if this was a fake news headline, and so I said, fair enough. Read the setting. Okay. Back to Snape, my ode to Alan Rickman. So the idea was that your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And if you dive into the dark arts, I think what I really think is interesting is that for this class, you do need to experiment with live doses of some of the dark arts to really get it, right? You really have to go through this experience in order to learn how to fight it. And it's kind of the same with misinformation. At least that's what we find in our interventions. So what did we do? We created a game. And John Rosenbeek, who was actually here at Darwin for his PhD, contributed mainly to the con. He's Dutch, like me, so my main role was to moderate his humor for an international audience. I'm about to show you some jokes, but it's it's a simulated engine, and the goal is to actively expose people to weakened microdoses of the techniques that are used to produce misinformation. Warn people in advance, show them how to deconstruct it so they can build up resilience, right, in sort of an edgy kind of way. What we didn't want is some boring media literacy lecture that nobody was going to engage with, because that's sort of the problem with a lot of these media literacy tools, that students don't want to engage with it because it's boring. And so that's what we try to do here. And so your goal is actually to gain as many followers as possible without losing any credibility by making use of some of these techniques. I once had David go through this game with the BBC, and he was terrible at it because he kept trying to do the right thing, as any actor would do. So the game will nudge you towards the path of the propagandist if you're trying to be clever and follow good editorial practices. Okay, so after long deliberation, the generals have decided to declare war on North Korea. # Kim Jong-un. This is not something Trump said, but maybe could have said. But notice, the Trump handle is manipulated. So this is part of a technique we call impersonation, which happens a lot. Scientists get impersonated, but also celebrities, right? Government politicians. Most people fail this on the pretest, but once they've been exposed to some weakened examples of how bad actors achieve these tweets, they get more resistance. For balance in the game, because we have Joe Biden now, so we have Joe, good old Joe here too. As your president, I've issued an executive order to rename Canada to North Dakota. # you got annexed. And so, I love how he smiles in the photo as it's Canada, they're so friendly. All right, mainstream media, one massive conspiracy, # fake news. Here we're impersonating NASA. And so on. So it's interactive. People respond to you, right? And they say, yay, here's some outrage about canceling SpongeBob. And so, you create your own echo chamber and filter bubble. And so the techniques are polarizing headlines, right? The us versus them kind of language, which also happens, a lot of the examples we use in the game are based on, new study finds people on the right have no brains, or, new study finds people on the left are humanitarian terrorists, or something like that. And so what we try to do is show people how these headlines are created. Impersonation, conspiracy theories, right? Create your own conspiracy. Turns out actually that they all use the same building blocks, and so it doesn't really matter what conspiracy we're talking about. There's a few key ingredients, and you can make your own. Trolling, which is big during elections, the use of emotions to manipulate people away from evidence. Sometimes people complain about this one, and they say, but emotions are good, right? We want outrage about things that are bad in the world and so on. But I think the thing for us is that the technique here is the appeal to emotion fallacy, which is when you use emotions to move people away from the evidence or distract people from the evidence, which is always kind of fallacious, even though we might consider that emotions are an important part of daily life. And discrediting using denial and sowing doubt about science and things like that. Okay, so stuff in the game is fictional, right? So it's not actual misinformation. It's weekends, it's all fictional, but it's based on reality. Somebody impersonated Warren Buffett, hundreds of thousands of followers, tweeting out stuff like, invest in what makes you happy. Total nonsense, right? Same technique as the Trump one, right? So we base it on reality, but it was all fictional. So does this actually work? So we build in some tests that you can see here. So again, not is this true or false, but how reliable people find this stuff. So we give people examples that are not, if you're a computer science a person, right, the testing set is different from the training, right? So the items here don't reflect the same items as in the game. The idea is to test for a broader sort of spectrum of immunity. If we now give people lots of examples using the same technique, do they get more immune? So this was during Game of Thrones a couple of years ago. I won't get started on the ending of that, but this was fake news. This is Johnson crude oil. Hey Leo, it's always snowing and freezing in New York. Could use some of that global warming you're always going on about. Right. So the idea is this false true. No, it's trolling, right? And that's why it's not accurate. So this was a very simple experiment, very opportunistic. It went viral on the internet. I think partly because we didn't say that, here's Cambridge telling you what you need to know. It was kind of undercover. So that this bad news thing went viral on Reddit. So we got lots of responses. So we had about 30,000 data points paired. Very simple, experiment pre-post. So for the true headlines that don't use manipulation, you can see, they remain the same pre and post. But for the headlines that make use of some of these techniques, people found them significantly less reliable after playing. Now the statistician here might say, you're showing people means. No. So here's the whole density distribution, right, for people start at different levels, whether you're left or right, young or old, but the intervention effect, these are medians, these are violent plots, so the intervention effect was about the same. Now, of course, one good criticism here is that this was voluntary opt-in, right, and so the sample was biased, people wanting to learn about fake news, and also their baseline susceptibility is therefore perhaps not super high. So we replicated the study. I had a PhD student who now graduated who loved puns, so every paper she published had a pun in it. So good news about bad news, which I don't know if that's an indicator for fake news in science, pun titles, but haven't investigated it. But we did a randomized replication of this, right? And now with the placebo group who played Tetris for 20 minutes, and yeah, we got a lot of emails from people saying, is this what Cambridge has come to, asking me to play Tetris for 20 minutes? But yes, if you were in a control group, that's what happened. And we had many more items, because it could be, the game takes up a lot of cloud space, so the more you test people, the slower the user experience. And so we took this in an embedded kind of survey environment and had a lot more items so we could do some proper psychometrics. And again, what you see in this, so here's the whole density distribution, not showing you truncated bar graphs, which is a popular misleading strategy in science that I'm sure everyone here is familiar with to blow up the means. So it looks a little less impressive, but what you see here is basically the density, right, around 0 for the control group, and then in the inoculation group, people find the misinformation significantly less reliable, right, the density shifts to the left, which means it's less reliable. Here's the effect size. People became also more confident, which is really important, because if you're not very confident in your own abilities, you're easily persuaded by people, particularly who try to manipulate you. So people also became more confident. then people said, okay, great, you can inoculate people, but how long does this thing actually last? Because we know from psychology that these things sometimes are transient, right? Because people go and they do other things. So I'll show you the same sort of setup. I'm not going to talk you through all these experiments because they're always the same. So we have this pretest where we give people a fake news quiz with 18 items, randomized to inoculation control, and then we do a post-test. But then we started following up with people week after week after week. This is called the misinformation attack. Sounds a bit nefarious, but basically we present people again with misinformation every week and see how they get on. The second experiment, exactly the same, but we don't do anything in between. We just follow up with people at the end after a couple months. And then some reviewers said, well, what if people are just remembering their answers on the survey? And I was like, well, I don't really remember what I had for dinner last night. But let's assume that people are remembering their patterns. So we switched out the items at each testing period in the final experiment. So what was funny was, so initially you see that, okay, people find it less reliable again, density shifting to the left. But this stayed the same the whole testing period. So I told Rukun, our student, like something funky is going on here, because even with the COVID vaccine, you need to be boosted, right? And so when we look at the second experiment, we actually found that something interesting, that at the end, people start finding misinformation more reliable again. You see this line here? It's still significantly different from control at the end, but it's about a more than 50% decay in the effect. It turns out that by engaging people in between, we're actually boosting them. And this is something we later verified using several experiments, that what happens is that people either lose their motivation to want to defend themselves, or they forget in their memory what the actual lessons were. And so you can boost people by targeting their memory as well as their motivation. And so, yeah, it doesn't last forever. It does, unfortunately, wear off. So we teamed up with the Foreign Office, who helped translate this into every major language now, so we could do large sort of cross-cultural studies, and there are interesting cross-cultural differences. We went into classrooms with students, so this was from a field experiment in Sweden. They were interested in whether the students learned better individually, in pairs, or in the whole class. And again, you can see people find the fake news, this time in Sweden, using local Swedish headlines, less reliable. So the average effect size is it's small because it's psychology, but we work with what we have. And they find real news more reliable after playing. So what we call real news is news that doesn't contain manipulation. But it also had some open-ended questions about what they were doing. And what's interesting is that you see they focus less on the content after our intervention and more on the manipulative strategy. So that doubles in their focus, which is kind of what we want. I kind of like that people are not changing their source heuristic, because we don't want to tell people that sources are bad, but the game doesn't really seem to affect people's source heuristic, which I think is interesting. I'm not going to go on and on about this. So we had an example from during the pandemic called Go Viral, which we did with the World Health Organization, which is kind of similar. Now it's a WhatsApp group, right? This global NGO covering up that eating kiwis cures the virus. And so total nonsense, but it's a similar sort of thing, right? University of Camford expert lizard people behind coronavirus. Harmony Square, which was during the US election with the Department of Homeland Security, very similar. It was about pineapple pizza. There's a festival, and we show people about trolling and foreign influence techniques, like should you put pineapple on pizza, or the Italians are going to find it really offensive, you shouldn't do that. And then other people say, well, this is America, freedom. I can put whatever I want on my pizza. And this is, you take a very innocuous issue and you get people riled up about it, and that's how you can undermine discourse. There's a photo of cats. Cat Park is one of our latest interventions, which is a noir game about extremism. And so, you move into a new city, which is exciting, but then the bad news is you have no friends. You're eating your noodles in your room and you're lonely, and then you get this message from an actor who says, "Come to this pub because we have something's going on. There's a cat park being erected. These elitists they're erecting a cat park, but then the suspicious thing is that there are no cats in the sea." And so you learn about this conspiracy, and then you go after the elites and so on. And so it is interesting. It kind of shows people, how radicalization happens when people are vulnerable. The funny thing, though, is that I drafted this memo for that was misinformation. I helped with some of the language of this memo that went out to all U.S. State Departments. We said, with the internet, only two things are certain: the global appeal of cat videos and the pervasiveness of disinformation. It turns out that there were some former Trump affiliates on this email list in the State Department. So that, you know, when the administrations transition, sometimes the old administration stays on the email list. And so they were very alarmed by our initiative to educate people about conspiracy theories. Professor works closely with the U.S. government's empirical reviewers at Harvard on psychological inoculation. I don't even know what that means. So I'm working closely with the government's empirical reviewers who are based at Harvard. So this is a journal at Harvard that we publish something in. But you know, they have this big board where they're connecting all the dots. You know, Biden, you know, all of the lawsuits against Biden at the moment with regards to, you know, misinformation research is very, very concerning. And basically they said, you know, funds cat bar game to inoculate youth against disinformation. You know, it's very politicized. You know, they think that, oh, you know, if you help people spot misinformation, if we say something and you categorize that as misinformation, then it's targeting us, right? And so this whole idea, I think, is really interesting to think about in the real world and how you navigate this. Okay, so I'll end by giving you a final example of how we scaled this. So we teamed up with Google, who said, look, these games are interesting. It's a fun science experiment, but you know, on social media, you have about 30 seconds with people. And so attention span's very low. People are not going to play a 20-minute game. So we need to do something else. They said, we're keen to help you with this pre-bunking approach. We recognize there's issues on the platforms. What if we do videos? And they said, you know, there's no headlines in videos, but there are political gurus who use misleading rhetoric to radicalize people, right? False dilemmas, ad hominem attacks, scapegoating. And so we did a bunch of lab experiments doing videos, very short videos that try to inoculate people. And they also said something very interesting. They said, oh, we don't want to be arbiters of truth. So the weekend dose can't be something about climate or immigration or abortion. They said, you know, we don't want people to come at us and say you're biased and so on. And so we started thinking about how could we weaken the weekend dose further and make it completely inactivated. And so we turned to popular culture. And in one of the videos that we tested, this is about false dichotomies, we which politicians love, by the way, right? Either we fix the NHS or we do something about immigration. Either you join ISIS or you're not a good Muslim. Either you're pro-automatic rifles or you're against the Second Amendment. These are all, it's an attempt to take away all nuance and gets people to more extremist modes of thinking, right? So what could the inoculation be that we could deploy without the sort of politicization that you might see? Here are 6 lab experiments that we did on all of these various techniques, and basically you find that, yeah, it helps people sort of spot the techniques. So here positive is good. They became more confident. They find misinformation, you know, less trustworthy, and are less, for most of them, but not all, less willing to sort of share this content. But the good reviewers at Science said, we don't believe surveys. And so, you know, these 6 pre-registered lab experiments are great, but you actually need to show this on social media. So we went back to Google and said, can't we just actually do this on YouTube? And they said, well, we do own YouTube. However, they don't tend to listen to us. And so there were years back and forth, and then they finally allowed us to actually do this on YouTube. And so there was a massive campaign on YouTube. So the idea here is the ad space, right? So the reason why they were thinking about herd immunity is, what if we could scale this in a way that could reach billions of people all at once? And so he said, your problem is opt-in and scaling. And so they said, what if we could take this for you and show billions of people the inoculation? Maybe then we'll have, you know, we're making some steps towards the idea of herd immunity. And they said, we'll put it in the ad space. So before people are exposed to misinformation, so that, you know, there's annoying ads you can't skip on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So I love this idea. So instead of them using it for profit, why not use it for science and education and put it in there. And that's what we did in this campaign. We had about 1 million people that either saw some control video about freeze or burn. So we spent a lot of time figuring out what people would find boring. And so freeze or burn was one of them, or one of our videos. And then we had about, they allowed us to give about 30% out of those 1 million people or so. We could sample about 30% randomly for a quiz that would also appear in the ad space about 24 hours after they were exposed to the campaign. So it wasn't direct, right? There was a delay of 24 hours. And this is real on social media when people are distracted. So what's the weekend dose? So the videos that we created leverage some element of popular culture. So the weekend dose of the false dichotomy here is Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith. I'm not sure if people are Star Wars fan, but Revenge of the Sith has a sort of scene where Anakin Skywalker, spoiler alert, who becomes Darth Vader, is talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he says, you know, you're either with me or you're my enemy, right? And then Obi says, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And so the video then says, like, look, don't, you know, nobody wants to be a Sith. Don't use these manipulation techniques. Now, for the clever listener, only a Sith deals in absolutes is also an absolute statement. But for the purpose of the videos, right, that's the inoculation. So we're not talking about anything. But it's the exact same structure, right? Either you're with me or you're against me. That's the exact same structure in all of the previous examples that I mentioned of what social media actually looks like. With scapegoating, we used a clip from South Park, right? We said, in South Park, it's always the Canadians who are responsible for all the issues, right? And so partisans in the States, you know, across the spectrum can appreciate that the Canadians are to blame, right? So that's the weekend dose, and so on. We also had The Simpsons. Google tested this with millennials and Gen Z, and they were like, "Wait, Star Wars, South Park, is this targeted at old people?" And so that was for TikTok. We're working on something slightly different. But then we test people with real stuff, right? Why give illegal immigrants to social services? We should be helping homeless Americans instead, right? That's a false dichotomy. Again, not is this true or false, just helping people recognize these techniques. Politicians pretend they're important people doing important work, but often they're important because they are parasites. They feed off others while creating no wealth of their own. Want to solve a problem? Start with them. It might feel that way, but it's still scapegoating. And so that's sort of the idea. Scientists lie and say they can measure global temperatures. It's impossible. What they won't tell you is that global warming has stopped almost completely in the last 23 years. Well, how is that possible if you can't measure it, right? This is called incoherence. And so what we do in these videos is basically that. So what are the results? Much smaller than the lab. So we were able to boost people by about 5 to 10% in this sort of context. Which, you know, these effects are much more modest than what you would see in a lab setting, but people are distracted, right? It's in the wild. And YouTube, you know, companies invest millions in boosting their brand recognition by 0.1% or 1%, right, on these platforms. So YouTube said, well, this lift between treatment and control of 5 to 10% for an ad, for a single ad that was actually very cheap to run, is good. They said we could scale this across billions of people for not a lot of money. Have they mandated it on the platform? No. Right, and so the problem with these companies is they often participate in the development of solutions, but then they don't go the final mile of actually implementing. So those discussions continue. Here's my own propaganda. If people are interested in learning more, and thanks so much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, questions?
Thank you, that's really fascinating. I'm just wondering one thing about your inoculation metaphor.
Yeah.
Whether that can mislead you. Because I would think, why give people a weakened dose of these techniques if you want to teach them about them? Why not give them really stark, clear examples so they can learn to recognize them?
Yeah, so, you know, there is it's an interesting question. You know, I think there is some people wonder about the risk of administering the full dose to people. So the theory of inoculation is premised on the idea that you take an argument or a case or an example and you severely weaken it, and then you make the refutation extremely persuasive so that people sort of generate the psychological resistance to it because they see the weakened argument and they have now a very strong response to it. If you make the misinformation too persuasive, people might not be able to counter it on their own, right? I guess you could help them in doing so, but there's a risk that people don't fully become resistant because they actually believe part of the misinformation because it's so persuasive, right? And so that's kind of the idea, that it has to be weakened in order to, you know, just as the vaccine, you don't want to inject people with the actual virus because that's going to lead people to become sick, right? And so the idea here is that if you administer the full dose, you might accidentally persuade people of the misinformation. And so it's a way to sort of reduce the risk in the strategy of the inoculation process. So we do try to weaken it in a way that kind of parallels the crux of these techniques. But we don't give people the full dose because then it's kind of like, okay, well, here's the counter argument and here's the misinformation, and people might become unsure about which is which is which, and so that's kind of why we follow this approach. I mean, we haven't tested it against a full example of misinformation and showing why that it's wrong. But this is what debunking typically does, right? So debunking will typically repeat the full dose of misinformation and then say this is false because so and so and so and so. And the problem with that is that it seems to activate too many links with the misinformation and people forget about the correction. And that's why this sort of pre-bunking using the weakened dose is generally thought to be a safer way of trying to do it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, great talk. I was wondering with the YouTube in real life experiment,
Yeah.
if you targeted specific videos or if it was just anything.
Yeah, good question. Now, so we screened for U.S. consumers of political news, and they didn't match the videos, against some impending misinformation specifically, because their algorithm is proprietary, and I'm obliged to say that when I talk about it, I sort of say that my ideal scenario would be that their algorithm, which may or may not exist, might be able to tell us with some probability that there's impending misinformation, which they may or may not be able to do, and could then automatically insert the right pre-bunk, right? So this is kind of the dream scenario, but they're not ready to do that because that involves some admission of knowing that there's misinformation and that they even know when it's about to appear, and that they might actually have to do something about it. So those, so that's the dream, but unfortunately, but I keep pushing them, and we're moving ahead very incrementally.
Thank you so much. In David's talk, he mentioned that people found balanced information about, say, nuclear power more persuasive, more trustworthy, than non-balanced information. And I wondered whether people who were trying to use misinformation for their own various ends had presumably also cottoned onto this and therefore were trying to present falsely balanced information. And therefore whether you had come up with any techniques to help consumers try to work out when the information is truly balanced versus falsely balanced, and whether you can inoculate against that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we do have we have one on fake experts and one on false balance, and so we do try to show people, okay, when is an expert? Because during COVID it got quite murky, right? So real doctor is talking about something, and and so the whole thing about how close people are to their expertise is one example that we use, and so in the videos the weakened dose is often something ridiculous. So somebody with a PhD in marketing talking about what surgery you need to do. But we also show people the closer and closer doctor talking about let's say a doctor who is a specialist in dermatology talking about vaccines or something like that, right? Isn't necessarily a great match, and so it's the closer the expertise is to the subject matter, right? The more trust people might want to have in the communicator. So that is something we do with the weakened dose. And then with false balance, we often talk about weight of evidence. So we try to inoculate people using this concept of weight of evidence. Right now, is this true or false? But is this some anecdote that's trying to appeal to your emotions, or is it the weight of hundreds of studies on a particular topic? So yeah, we do try to experiment with that. What's interesting though is kind of analogous to what David was saying. Some people complain about the technique level inoculation. So you can also inoculate against specific issues and specific myths, right? Sometimes people complain about the technique level because you're not telling people what to do, right? So they're basically saying, okay, you're showing people how to recognize these techniques, but what if good actors use these techniques? And that kind of goes back to the white hat sort of bias that some people don't like it and say yeah, but the BBC also publishes emotional headlines and clickbait, and are you saying the BBC is fake news? And it's no, we're not saying the BBC is fake news, but if people come across individual headlines, regardless of the source who use these techniques, then people should find those headlines somewhat less reliable, right? Of course, if people then say, oh, the BBC is fake news, that's maybe one step too much and we have to recalibrate people, but that's typically not what we find. We find that, people become more skeptical of headlines that use these techniques, regardless of the source. But yeah, it certainly irks some people that, when it's ostensibly used for a good cause, like climate, that people might still recognize these techniques, right? If I say, oh, we're all going to die tomorrow because of climate change, people go through our intervention, they will say, oh, that's fear-mongering. But then some people will say, hey, but you're undermining action on climate change. And so that's, it's an interesting debate.